Chapter 1. The Whispering Forest. The trees stood tall and motionless, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The forest of Eldermere had long been known for its eerie silence, except for the whispers that drifted through the air when the wind was still. No one could explain where the voices came from, nor who or what might be speaking. Lena had always been drawn to mysteries, and the legend of the Whispering Forest was one she couldn't resist. As a researcher of folklore, she traveled the world collecting stories, but something about Eldermere felt different. The locals warned her not to go in after dusk, to ignore the voices should she hear them, but warnings had never stopped her before. One crisp autumn evening, Lena found herself standing at the forest's edge, her lantern flickering in the cool night air. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The path beneath her feet was well-trodden, yet somehow it felt untouched, as if the forest had been waiting for someone to walk its trails again. At first, there was nothing but silence, thick and heavy. Then, just as she reached a clearing where the air smelled faintly of damp earth and moss, she heard it, a whisper. Soft, barely discernible, yet unmistakably there. "Turn back." Lena froze. The voice was neither threatening nor kind, it was simply present. She turned her head, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Swallowing her nerves, she took another step forward. The whispering grew louder. More voices joined, overlapping in a hushed, rhythmic chant. She pulled out her recorder, pressing the button with steady fingers. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the chill crawling up her spine. The wind picked up, swirling the fallen leaves around her feet. The voices did not answer, but instead a single word surfaced from the chorus. "Remember." Lena's breath hitched. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to remember? She had never been here before, and yet an odd sensation of familiarity settled in her chest, as if she had walked these woods long ago, in a life she could not recall. Shadows shifted between the trees. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting long, wavering beams of light. Then, as quickly as the voices had risen, they faded into silence once more. The wind died, the leaves settled, and the forest stood still once again. Heart pounding, Lena checked her recorder. The time was running, but the screen showed no audio levels, no evidence of sound. As she stared at the device, a final whisper curled through the air, soft as a sigh. "You were one of us." A chill ran down her spine, and for the first time in her life, Lena felt the weight of a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. The forest watched as she turned and walked away, its whispers retreating into the night, waiting for the next seeker to return. Chapter 2. The Endless Footsteps. The train station at Hollow's End had been abandoned for decades, its rusting tracks leading nowhere, its platform covered in moss and scattered leaves. Yet on quiet nights, the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, as if travelers long forgotten still made their way to unknown destinations. Mark, a photographer with an eye for forgotten places, had heard the stories. He arrived just past midnight, his camera slung over his shoulder, ready to capture the eerie beauty of the station's decay. The night was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. He set up his tripod, adjusted the lens, and snapped the first shot. Click. A shuffle of footsteps echoed in the distance. Mark paused, glancing over his shoulder. The platform was empty, save for the peeling benches and a single rusted lamppost that flickered with weak light. Brushing it off as an animal or the wind, he returned to his work. Click. The footsteps sounded again. Closer this time. Deliberate, heavy boots on wooden planks, the cadence steady, rhythmic. Mark's breath hitched as he slowly turned his head. Still nothing. He raised his camera and took another picture, this time facing the direction of the sound. Click. The footsteps stopped. Mark lowered the camera and checked the screen. His breath caught in his throat. In the photograph, just beyond the faded departure sign, stood a shadowy figure, a blurred silhouette, featureless, yet unmistakably human. A chill crept up his spine. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity kept him rooted in place. "Hello?" he called. his voice barely above a whisper. The empty platform held its silence. Then, without warning, the footsteps began again. This time, running straight toward him, Mark turned and bolted. His heart pounded as he leapt over a broken bench and sprinted toward the station's entrance. The footsteps chased him, faster, closer, echoing in perfect unison with his own. Just as he reached his car, the sound stopped. Gasping for breath, he whipped around. The station was empty, silent once more, the lamp flickering weakly above the platform. His hands trembled as he lifted his camera and checked the last photo. The figure was gone, but in the corner of the image, where no one had been standing, was a single phrase scrawled across the wooden planks. Next departure, you. Chapter 3. The Silent Passenger. The night bus drifted along the lonely countryside road, its headlights cutting a soft glow through the mist that rolled across the pavement. Jacob leaned against the window, his thoughts fading in and out with the rhythm of the gentle motion. The hum of the engine, the occasional sway of the bus, and the dim golden light from the overhead lamps all wrapped around him like a quiet lullaby. He had taken this route many times before. There was something comforting about traveling at night. Less noise, fewer people, just the soft world outside melting into darkness. The mist thickened, curling around the trees that lined the road, their silhouettes stretching like sentinels in the night. At the next stop, the doors parted. A figure stepped aboard, moving with an unhurried grace. Jacob barely registered them at first, lost in his own thoughts. But as the figure glided past the other seats, an odd awareness settled in his chest. It wasn't fear, just something unfamiliar. The figure chose the seat across from him. The hood of their coat hung low, obscuring their face in soft shadow. They sat so still, their posture relaxed yet unnaturally composed. Jacob shifted slightly, glancing toward the driver, but the man's face remained turned forward, unconcerned. The other passengers, scattered few that they were, seemed unaffected, staring ahead as if caught in their own quiet worlds. He tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on the passing landscape. The mist outside had deepened, softening the outlines of distant hills and road signs. Time stretched, and the bus carried on, its motion smooth and unbroken. Yet no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he kept being drawn back to the stillness across from him. The figure hadn't moved once. Not a shift of their hands, not a rise of their chest from steady breath. Even the folds of their coat seemed untouched by the motion of the bus. Jacob turned his gaze forward again, letting his mind wander. Perhaps he was overthinking it. The quiet had a way of making things seem stranger than they were. Then, just on the edge of sound, he thought he heard something, a whisper, distant, almost like a memory sliding past his ear. It wasn't words exactly, more like an echo of something forgotten. He glanced back at the figure, and this time he saw. The hood had slipped just enough in the dim lighting to reveal what lay beneath. Nothing. No face, no skin, just the impression of something unfinished, as though the person had never fully formed. A hollow space where a presence should have been. Jacob's breath slowed. He didn't move, didn't speak, only let the realization settle like mist over his thoughts. The bus carried on, steady and endless, as if traveling through a space outside of time. Then, for the first time, the figure turned its head, slow, deliberate. Though there were no eyes, Jacob felt its awareness settle on him, felt the weight of something ancient and patient. A voice, low and distant, curled through the air like a fading dream. Not yet. The bus slowed. The figure stood, stepping toward the exit with that same effortless motion. As the doors parted, they stepped out, not onto the roadside, not onto pavement, but into the mist itself, vanishing as though they had never been there at all. The bus moved forward again, the moment passing as softly as it had come. The other passengers remained still, untouched by what had transpired. The driver said nothing. Jacob sat in silence, the hum of the road beneath him once again, the only sound. But something had changed. The next time he took this route, he knew the passenger might return. And next time, he might not be the one to leave. Chapter 4. The house that waited. The road leading to the house was nearly forgotten, a narrow dirt path overtaken by nature's slow reclaim. Trees leaned in from both sides, their branches arching overhead like silent watchers, filtering the moonlight into shifting patterns along the ground. Eleanor had heard of the house before, whispers in town about the old estate hidden deep in the woods, its doors untouched for decades. It wasn't abandoned, not exactly, it simply waited. No one could remember who had last lived there, yet the house remained as though expecting someone to return. The windows, though coated in years of dust, remained unbroken. The door never sagged from its frame. Even the garden, though overgrown, held the remnants of careful tending, wild roses blooming defiantly in the tangled vines. Eleanor was drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain. She had no connection to the house, no reason to be here, and yet the moment she saw it, something in her chest tightened, like a memory she had almost grasped but lost again. The door was unlocked. It didn't creak, didn't resist. It opened with the ease of something long prepared for this moment. Inside, the air was cool, still, carrying the scent of aged wood and distant rain. The furniture remained untouched, a grand piano standing silent in the parlor, its keys coated in a fine layer of dust. A single chair had been pulled up to it, as if someone had been about to play, and simply never had. Eleanor's footsteps made no sound against the wooden floors. She moved deeper into the house, trailing her fingers along the faded wallpaper. The feeling of familiarity grew stronger, like a forgotten melody trying to surface. And then she saw it. A painting hanging in the dim hallway. The frame was heavy, its edges worn with time, but it was the subject that sent a shiver through her. An old portrait of a woman. She knew that face. Not from a book, not from history. She knew it the way one remembers a childhood home, the way a song lingers even after years of silence. The woman's eyes were soft, distant, holding the weight of something unfinished. Eleanor reached out. A soft breath of air stirred through the hallway, though there were no windows open. The light overhead flickered, not sharply, not harshly, but as if responding to something unseen. Then, from somewhere within the house, a note rang out. The piano, the sound was delicate, a single key pressed with the careful touch of unseen fingers. It echoed softly through the space, fading into the stillness. Eleanor turned back to the portrait. The woman's expression had changed. Not by much, just the faintest tilt of her lips, the barest shift in her gaze. She was waiting, not in a menacing way, not in warning, just waiting as the house had been, as the roses in the garden had been. Eleanor stepped back, her breath slowing, her heart steady. She understood now. This place had always been meant for her. The house had never been abandoned. It had simply been waiting for her to come home. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Room. The inn at the edge of town had stood for centuries, its stone walls weathered by time but never crumbling. Travelers passed through its doors every night, resting their heads in rooms that carried echoes of countless stories. Among them, one story was never spoken aloud, only whispered by those who had stayed long enough to notice: Room 306. It was not haunted in the traditional sense. There were no flickering lights, no sudden chills, no shadows moving where none should be. No, Room 306 simply disappeared. It wasn't always there. Some nights, it stood among the numbered doors on the third floor like any other. But on other nights, guests would climb the stairs only to find the numbers skipping from 305 to 307, as if the room had never existed at all. Daniel arrived at the inn late, his body weary from the long journey. The clerk handed him a key with a quiet smile, barely glancing at the number etched into the brass tag. He didn't check it himself, not until he stood at the top of the stairs, tracing his fingers over the number on the door. 306. The room existed tonight. A quiet hum filled the air, a sound too soft to place but too steady to ignore. He hesitated for only a moment before turning the key, pushing the door open with the ease of someone who had done this before, though he never had. The room was ordinary. A simple bed, a writing desk, a window overlooking the silent streets below. The furniture was old but well kept, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that held the scent of time. Yet something felt unsettled. Not wrong, not dangerous, just as if the room itself was waiting for something. He set his bag down, moving toward the window. The town outside was still, the streetlights casting a soft glow on empty sidewalks. When he turned back, the room felt different, as if he had stepped into a space that wasn't quite aligned with the one he had entered moments ago. The wallpaper's pattern seemed unfamiliar, the desk slightly closer to the bed than before. He frowned, brushing off the thought. Travel exhaustion, nothing more. The bed was inviting, the sheets crisp and cool. He lay back, exhaling deeply, allowing his mind to sink into the comfort of rest. Sleep found him easily, and then it left just as quickly. A sound stirred him, a gentle rustling, like pages turning in a book. He opened his eyes. The lamp beside the bed was still on, casting a soft glow over the room. But something was different again. The desk chair was turned slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. He sat up, his heart steady, his breath calm. The hum in the air was softer now, almost blending into the quiet of the night. The wallpaper seemed to have shifted again, its floral pattern now geometric, its color subtly darker. He stood, moving toward the door. When he reached for the knob, his fingers met smooth wood. No handle, no keyhole, just an unbroken surface where the door should have been. He inhaled slowly, no panic, no fear, only the understanding that this was exactly what the room did. It changed, it vanished, and it took those inside with it. The window was still there. He stepped toward it, looking out once more. The town was different. The buildings were taller, the streets narrower. The lights had a softer glow, as if burning from a different time. The world beyond the glass was no longer the one he had arrived in. He turned back to the room. The chair was occupied now. A figure sat there, not unkind, not threatening, just watching, waiting. Their face was not unfamiliar, though he could not name them. Their presence was not unwelcome, though he had never met them. They raised a hand, fingers brushing the air as if gesturing towards something unseen. And then the hum faded. The next morning, the innkeeper found room 306 exactly as it had always been, empty, untouched. The bed was neatly made, the desk undisturbed. The key sat on the nightstand, though no guest had turned it in. The inn carried on, as it always had. And some nights, when the room decided to return, it waited once more for the next traveler, who would unknowingly step inside. Chapter 6. The Candle in the Window. The manor had stood on the edge of the valley for as long as anyone could remember. Its tall windows overlooked the rolling hills, and its stone walls carried the weight of forgotten years. Though no one had lived there in decades, a single candle always burned in the highest window, flickering softly against the night sky. It never wavered in the wind, never melted down to its wick. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, never questioning why the candle remained or who kept it lit. Some said it was a remnant of a love lost to time, a beacon waiting for someone who would never return. Others believed it was a message, a signal from something that still lingered within the empty halls. Illa had always been drawn to the manor. As a historian, she sought out places where time had settled in quiet patience, where stories waited to be uncovered. On the night of the full moon, she found herself standing before the gates, gazing up at the solitary light in the highest window. A soft breeze curled around her, carrying the scent of old stone and distant rain. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid of places like this. The door was heavy but not locked. It opened with a quiet ease, as if expecting her arrival. Inside, the air was cool and still, untouched by the passage of years. The grand staircase led upward, its steps worn smooth by the footsteps of those long gone. She followed the flickering glow. Each step carried her higher, past empty rooms filled with forgotten furniture, past portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her with silent recognition. There was no dust here, no signs of decay. The house had not been abandoned. It had simply been waiting. At last she reached the highest floor. The corridor stretched before her, lined with closed doors, but only one was open. The candle's glow spilled from within, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. She stepped forward, her breath steady, her heart calm. Inside the room, the candle sat upon a wooden table. The flame flickered, though there was no breeze. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each filled with volumes untouched by time. A chair sat before the table, its surface worn by years of quiet use. And then she saw her, a woman seated in the chair, her face turned toward the window. Her presence was not solid, not quite formed, as if she existed just between the edge of light and shadow. Her posture was relaxed, her hands resting gently in her lap. She was waiting. Illa stepped closer, the floorboards silent beneath her feet. The woman did not turn, but her voice, when it came, was soft, barely more than a breath. "You came." Illa felt a shiver, not of fear, but of something deeper, recognition, understanding. As if somehow she had always known this moment would come, the candle's flame danced, its glow growing warmer. The woman's form wavered, the edges of her presence shifting like mist caught in the morning light. "You've been waiting," Illa whispered. The woman nodded, her gaze still fixed beyond the window, looking out into the night. For so long, the air in the room grew lighter, as if a weight had begun to lift. Illa stepped closer, reaching out, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. The moment her skin met the wood, the candle's flame stilled. The woman turned to her then, her eyes filled with something unspoken, something that had been carried for centuries. And in that instant, Illa understood, the waiting was over. The candle flickered once, then extinguished, its light fading into the quiet night. The next morning, when the townspeople looked up at the old manor, the window was dark, for the first time in 100 years. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Library. Deep in the countryside, hidden beyond overgrown paths and whispering trees, stood a library that few remembered. It was never built on any map, nor did it appear in any records, yet those who wandered far enough sometimes stumbled upon its doors. The building stood untouched by time, its wooden beams sturdy, its stone foundation cool beneath creeping ivy. Its windows were neither broken nor clouded with dust, and its doors, though old, were never locked. Samuel had spent his life chasing stories. A traveling poet, he sought out forgotten places, collecting pieces of history that had been left behind. He never expected to find the library. One autumn afternoon, as the sun dipped behind a shroud of mist, he followed an unfamiliar path through the trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old paper, though he saw no books, no sign of people. And then, beyond the veil of leaves, the building appeared. Its doors stood open, inviting but unassuming. Inside, the scent of aged parchment filled the space. Bookshelves lined the walls, stretching far beyond what the small exterior suggested. Endless corridors branched in every direction, each shelf meticulously arranged, yet there was no sign of a librarian. The silence was comforting, as though the very air carried the weight of countless untold stories. Samuel stepped forward, his fingers trailing along the spines of books bound in deep burgundy, navy, and faded gold. Some had titles engraved in elegant script, others bore no names at all. His gaze fell upon a single book resting on an empty shelf. Unlike the others, this one looked newer, untouched by time's hand. When he pulled it free, his breath caught. His name was on the cover. He turned the pages, his hands steady despite the quiet tremor in his chest. Each word was familiar, not because he had read them before, but because they were his. His memories, written in delicate ink, as though someone had been recording his life from the very beginning. Conversations he had long forgotten, moments he had thought lost, every page held a piece of him. And then, as he neared the final chapter, the words changed. The story continued beyond his own memory, describing paths he had never walked, choices he had never made. It was a glimpse into a life he had not yet lived, one that felt as real as the past he knew. His fingers hesitated over the last page. The ink shimmered, shifting slightly, as if waiting for him to decide. He could turn back, place the book upon the shelf, and leave as though he had never found this place. Or he could read on, allowing the story to unfold, allowing the library to show him what lay ahead. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath, the silence thick with quiet expectation, and then, ever so gently, the ink on the last page began to fade. Not yet. Samuel exhaled, closing the book with careful hands. He placed it back where he had found it, feeling the weight of something unspoken settle within him. The library had given him a glimpse, nothing more. A reminder that some stories were still being written. As he stepped outside, the mist had lifted. The trees stood quiet, unmoving. When he turned back, the library was gone. Chapter 8. The Keeper of Lost Names. At the heart of the old city, where cobblestone streets wound in forgotten patterns, there stood a bridge that few noticed. It was not grand, nor adorned with statues or inscriptions, yet it had stood longer than any of the buildings around it. The river beneath moved slowly, its surface reflecting the flickering glow of lanterns. But those who stopped to listen, truly listened, sometimes heard something beneath the water's lull. A whisper too soft to be carried by the wind. A name, spoken as if calling from the depths of time. Nina had spent years searching for a name. As a genealogist, she traced the lines of family trees, following the ink of history to those who had long since been forgotten. But there was one name missing from her own past, a great-grandmother erased from records, lost to time. No documents, no gravestone, only a lingering absence where a life should have been. She found herself on the bridge one evening, the weight of the search settling in her bones. The city was quiet, the air thick with the scent of rain yet to fall. She leaned on the railing, watching the river's surface ripple in the dim glow of streetlights. And then she heard it. A voice, neither loud nor urgent, but certain. A whisper carried on the water's slow movement. A name. It slipped through her mind like something she had always known but never spoken aloud. It fit perfectly into the empty space in her family's past, filling a void that had stretched for generations. She breathed it out, testing its weight on her tongue. The moment she spoke it, the air shifted. The river's reflection deepened, the city's light stretching farther than before. She did not question how or why. Some names, once spoken, find their way home. The next morning, when she searched the records again, the name was there exactly where it had always been. Chapter 9. The House That Dreamed. At the end of a narrow country road, hidden between the folds of rolling hills, stood a cottage covered in ivy. It had been there for longer than anyone could remember, though no one seemed to know who had built it. Its wooden beams had not rotted. Its roof remained intact, and the garden, though wild, never overtook the path leading to the front door. Anna arrived on a quiet autumn afternoon, the air thick with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. She was an artist in search of solitude, a place where inspiration could flow freely without the weight of the world pressing in. The cottage had called to her, though she could not explain why. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it, a presence, not unwelcome, but aware. The walls bore no signs of recent life, yet there was no dust, no chill of abandonment. The furniture remained in place, as though waiting for someone to return. A painting hung above the fireplace, an old portrait of a woman whose eyes seemed familiar, though Anna was certain she had never seen her before. That night, as she lay in the quiet warmth of the cottage, her dreams came alive. They were not like ordinary dreams, fleeting and abstract. These were vivid, layered with detail, so precise it felt as though she had stepped into another life. She stood in the same cottage, but the walls were different, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and burning wood. She saw a family gathered around the hearth, their laughter blending with the crackle of flames. And then she saw herself, though not as she was now, a different version, dressed in clothes from another time, her hands covered in paint, a canvas stretched before her. When she woke, the memory of the dream lingered as real as any moment she had lived. The painting above the fireplace caught her eye once more, and this time she noticed something new. The woman's face had changed, just slightly, her expression softer, more knowing. Each night, the dreams continued. Some were from distant pasts, others from futures not yet lived, and each morning, when Anna awoke, she painted them, scenes from lives that were and lives that could be. The cottage was dreaming, and through it so was she. She never questioned whether the house had chosen her, or if she had chosen it. Some places remember. Some places hold on to time in ways the world cannot explain, and some, like this cottage, only awaken when the right soul walks through the door. Chapter 10. The Lantern Keeper. There was a village by the sea where the cliffs met the endless horizon, where the waves whispered against the rocks in a rhythm only the ocean could understand. Each night, when the sky darkened and the stars blinked to life, a single lantern could be seen moving along the cliff's edge. It never faltered, never dimmed, and though many had seen it, few had ever met the one who carried it. Dorian had grown up hearing the stories. The Lantern Keeper, they called her. An old woman who walked the cliffs, guiding lost souls home. Some believed she was a spirit, an echo of someone who had once lived there long ago. Others said she was real, a guardian who had simply outlived the memory of those who had known her. One evening, as the tide rolled in, Dorian found himself walking the same path. The wind carried the scent of salt and distant rain, the sea stretching far beyond sight. And then ahead of him, the glow of the lantern appeared, steady as the rising moon. He quickened his pace, though the figure holding the lantern did not turn. She moved with an ease that defied her apparent age, her steps light despite the uneven ground. "Why do you walk here every night?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the wind. The woman stopped, the lantern's glow casting long shadows across the ground. When she turned to him, her eyes were kind but unreadable, holding the depth of years unspoken. "For those still finding their way home," she said simply. Dorian felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. That night, a storm rolled in. The waves crashed against the cliffs, and in the distance he saw it, a ship, its sails torn, drifting toward the rocks. The wind howled, pulling the sea into a restless fury. And then, just as disaster loomed, the lantern's glow intensified, cutting through the storm's chaos like a beacon. The ship veered, just enough to miss the jagged cliffs, its course shifting toward calmer waters. When Dorian turned back, the woman was gone. The next night, when he walked the cliffs again, he found the lantern resting on a smooth stone, its flame still burning. He lifted it carefully, feeling the warmth against his fingertips. From that night on, it was his to carry. Chapter 11. The Staircase that led nowhere. Deep within the valley, where mist curled around the trees and the earth held the scent of rain-soaked leaves, there stood a staircase. It was old, its wooden steps worn smooth by time, its railings draped in vines that bloomed even in the coldest seasons. But there was no house, no ruins, no foundation to suggest what it had once belonged to. It simply stood there, rising into the open air, leading to nothing at all. Elias had heard the stories, the warnings from the older folks in town, who spoke of the staircase as something to be avoided. Some said it had always been there, appearing in the mist when no one was watching. Others whispered of those who had climbed it, only to vanish before reaching the top. But Elias was not one to fear the unknown. He was a seeker of mysteries, drawn to the quiet hum of places that didn't fit within the world's understanding. So one evening, as the fog rolled in thick and silver, he found himself standing before the staircase. The air was still, heavier than it should have been. He placed a foot on the first step. The wood did not creak beneath his weight, though it should have. Another step. The mist wrapped around him, muffling the sounds of the forest. By the fifth step, the world below seemed farther away than it should have been. The trees blurred, the ground fading into an expanse of nothingness. Something shifted. A sound, soft as breath, brushed past his ear. A voice, not spoken, but felt. It was not a warning, It was an invitation. He continued to climb. The air changed with each step, growing warmer, filled with the scent of something both familiar and distant. And then, as he reached what should have been the top, he found himself standing not in empty air, but in a place he did not recognize. The sky stretched wider than he had ever seen, painted in hues of twilight that did not belong to this world. Before him stood a house, not ancient, not ruined, but whole, its windows glowing with soft light. It was as though he had stepped into a memory, a place that had been waiting for him to arrive. He took a breath, the air rich with the scent of evening blossoms. The door before him creaked open, though no one stood there to greet him. Some staircases lead to nowhere, and some lead home. Chapter 12. The Echoing Footsteps. In the heart of an old city, nestled between narrow alleyways and buildings that leaned with time, there was a street unlike any other. It was paved with stones, worn smooth by centuries of travelers, yet no matter the hour, it was always empty. No merchants called out their wares, no carriages rolled through its length, and yet those who passed through always heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, just behind them. Lena had walked the city countless times, her work as an archivist leading her through its oldest streets. She had heard the stories of the echoing footsteps, but like most, she dismissed them as tricks of the mind. Until one evening, when she found herself alone on that street, the air thick with the scent of rain yet to fall. Her own steps tapped lightly against the stones, and then another set followed. Not in front of her, not beside her, but behind. The rhythm was precise, perfectly matching her own. She paused, and so did they. A quiet weight settled in the air. She turned. Nothing. The street stretched empty, the glow of lanterns casting long shadows against the walls. Slowly, she continued walking. The footsteps resumed, but this time they changed. They no longer matched hers exactly. They were slower, as though the unseen presence was no longer just following, but waiting. At the end of the street stood an archway, half hidden by ivy, leading into a courtyard she had never noticed before. The footsteps stopped as she stepped inside. A bench sat beneath an ancient tree, its branches stretching wide, sheltering the space in a hush of stillness. On the bench lay a book, its cover worn with age. When she lifted it, the pages fluttered open, not at the beginning, but somewhere near the end. There, written in ink that had not yet fully dried, was her name. Lena traced the letters with her fingertips. The ink smudged slightly, fresh as though someone had written it moments before. She looked around once more, but the street beyond was silent. No footsteps followed as she walked away. But she knew, without a doubt, that the next person to pass through that street would hear them again. Chapter 13. The Room That Wasn't There. There was a house at the edge of town, built from stone that had long since faded to the color of dusk. It was unremarkable in appearance, yet those who lived within its walls often spoke of something peculiar, a door that did not always exist. It was not in the hallway, nor tucked away in some forgotten corner. Instead, it appeared when it wished, where it wished. Sometimes in the study, nestled between bookshelves that had stood undisturbed for years. Other times at the end of a corridor that had always led to a blank wall. The door was never locked. But those who opened it found only a darkened room beyond. And in the quiet of night, when the house settled into silence, some swore they could hear breathing from the other side. Daniel had never believed in such things. He had lived in the house for years and had never seen the door himself. It was an old place, full of creaks and shifting shadows. Stories had a way of growing in places like these. But one evening, as he returned home and stepped into the hallway, he saw it. The door stood where there had always been nothing but smooth, unbroken wall. Its frame was dark wood, its handle cold beneath his touch. A hush filled the air, thick and expectant. With a slow breath, he turned the handle. The room beyond was unlike the rest of the house. The air carried the scent of aged paper and something fainter, something almost metallic. A single chair sat in the center, facing a tall mirror that reflected not only the room but something else, something that did not belong. He stepped forward, his own reflection moving with him. And then, just for a moment, there was a shift. The reflection did not match his movement. A heartbeat later, the air changed. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, as though exhaling after a long-held breath. The mirror clouded over, the image within it fading into something deeper, something vast. Daniel felt the urge to step closer. But just as his foot touched the floor, the mirror's surface rippled, once, twice before stilling. When he turned back, the door was gone. The next morning, he searched the house. Every hallway, every wall, there was no sign it had ever been there. But in the silence of the night, as he lay in bed, he thought he heard something faint, distant, like the sound of a door creaking open somewhere just beyond his reach. Chapter 14. The Watcher in the Fog. In a village surrounded by rolling hills and winding rivers, the fog came often. It moved in slow waves, drifting through the streets like something alive, muffling sound and turning familiar paths into endless corridors of mist. Most who lived there were used to it, carrying lanterns and treading carefully when the fog was thickest. But there was one thing they all knew: never look too long into the mist, because sometimes something looked back. Ilara had grown up with these stories. The Watcher, they called it. A figure glimpsed only in the heaviest fog, standing just beyond reach. It never moved, never made a sound. But those who stared too long always felt it, an awareness, a presence settling over them like the weight of unseen eyes. One evening, as the fog rolled in thicker than ever before, Ilara found herself walking home later than usual. The streets were empty, the houses quiet, their windows glowing faintly behind shifting curtains of mist. Then movement, a shadow, just at the edge of her vision, not shifting, not fading like the fog itself, but standing, still, watching. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to keep walking. Faster now, though she did not run. She knew better than to run. The lantern she carried flickered slightly, the air pressing around her in a way that felt almost tangible. The Watcher did not follow, did not approach. It never did. But as she neared her home, she made the mistake of glancing back. The shadow had not moved, and yet it was closer. The breath in her lungs turned shallow. Her fingers tightened around the lantern's handle. She stepped onto her porch, pushing the door open quickly and slipping inside. The wood closed behind her with a quiet finality. She did not look out the window. She did not need to, because in the deep silence of the fog-drenched night, she knew it was still there, waiting. Chapter 15. The Whispering Tide. Along the shore where the waves stretched endlessly to meet the horizon, there was a stretch of sand where no one lingered after dusk. The tide whispered there, not in the way water normally did, but in a way that carried words, faint, indecipherable, but undeniably present. No one knew when it had started, only that those who stood too long at the water's edge would hear voices rising from the depths, calling, beckoning, speaking in tones that sent a shiver through the bones. Some said they were echoes of the lost, sailors swallowed by the sea long ago. Others believed the ocean itself remembered things people had long since forgotten. Jonah had always been drawn to the sea, his days spent watching the shifting tides, the endless motion of water against stone. He had heard the warnings, of course, but curiosity had a way of unraveling caution. One evening, as the last light of the sun faded, he walked along the shore, his feet sinking slightly into the damp sand. The tide was pulling in, its voice softer than usual, a rhythmic hush that seemed to weave through the quiet air. Then, as he stepped closer, the whispering began. It was subtle at first, like wind shifting through reeds. But then, beneath the sound of waves, something else took shape, words blurred by distance yet unmistakable in their intent. Jonah stilled. The ocean stretched wide before him, dark and endless, its surface shifting under the fading glow of twilight. The voices did not come from above or around, but from beneath, rising through the depths, threading through the water like something alive. He listened, though he did not understand. The sound was neither welcoming nor threatening, simply present, filling the space between moments, as though the sea had always spoken, and only now had he learned to hear it. A wave rolled in, lapping at his feet, and for the briefest instant, something brushed against his skin, not solid, not quite touchable, but real. Jonah stepped back. The whispering faded, retreating with the tide. He did not run, did not turn his back to the water. Instead, he lingered just long enough to hear the final echo of the voices before they disappeared into the vastness once more. The sea, it seemed, had told him all it wished to say. For now. Chapter 16. The Unfinished Lullaby. There was a melody that drifted through the halls of the old estate. A tune without a name, played on an instrument no one could see. It was never loud, never intrusive, just a soft, lingering lullaby that rose and fell like a breath in the stillness of night. Eleanor had never believed the stories. A house settling, wind moving through the eaves. There were 100 explanations for sounds in an old place like this. But the melody was different. It carried warmth, sorrow, and something unfinished, as if waiting for an end that never came. She had inherited the estate only weeks ago, its rooms untouched for decades. Dust still clung to forgotten furniture, the scent of age and memory woven into the air. But on her first night there, just as sleep hovered near, she heard it. Faint notes, drifting through the quiet, not from the halls, not from the walls, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere within the house itself. She rose, following the sound through the darkened corridors, her bare feet brushing against cold wooden floors. The melody was clearer now, wrapping around her like something familiar, something almost remembered. It led her to the music room. A grand piano sat in the corner, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. No one had played it in years, yet the notes continued, soft as a whisper, lingering in the air even as she stepped closer. Eleanor reached out, brushing her fingers along the keys. The moment she did, the melody stopped. Silence, a hush deeper than night itself, settled over the room. And then, just for a moment, she felt it. A presence, something unseen, yet near, hovering at the edge of awareness. Not watching, not threatening, just waiting. Her fingers moved instinctively, pressing down on a single key. A note rang out, blending with the stillness. Then another, and another. The lullaby had been waiting to be finished. And as Eleanor played, the air in the room grew lighter, the weight of years lifting, the melody finally coming to its quiet, gentle close. She let the last note fade into the silence. And for the first time since she had arrived, the house felt at peace. Chapter 17. The Mirror That Watched. Mirrors have always been strange things, reflecting, yet never truly revealing. They show what stands before them, but never what lingers behind. And in the old manor, where time seemed to move slower, there was one mirror that was different. It stood at the end of a long corridor, its frame carved with intricate patterns that no one could quite place. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, yet no one knew where it had come from. Servants whispered about it, saying it was older than the house itself, that it had seen things no one else had. But what made it truly unsettling was the way it seemed to notice those who passed. Eliza had never paid much attention to it before. She had grown up in the manor, her childhood spent wandering its vast halls, the mirror always just another piece of furniture. But on the evening of her 21st birthday, something changed. She had been walking through the corridor, the candle in her hand casting flickering light against the walls. As she passed the mirror, she caught movement, just the barest shift, like a ripple in still water. She stopped, turned back. Her reflection stood as it should, the candlelight glinting off the glass, and yet something felt wrong. The air was heavier, the space around her quieter than it should have been. Then, barely perceptible, her reflection did something it should not have done. It blinked, just a fraction of a second too late. A chill moved through her spine, her breath catching in her throat. The mirror was not just reflecting, it was watching. Eliza stepped closer, her pulse quickening. The glass held her image, unbroken, unchanging. But now that she was looking, really looking, she noticed it. The carved frame, the ornate patterns that wrapped around its edges, they were not just decorative, they were words, tiny curling inscriptions, forming a language she did not recognize. Her fingers hesitated before brushing against the surface. The moment she touched the glass, a soft sound filled the air, not a voice, not a whisper, but something in between. It wasn't coming from behind her, it was coming from the mirror itself. She yanked her hand away. The reflection smiled. Not her smile, not her face, not truly. It was almost hers, almost but not quite. The candle flickered, the shadows shifting. She stepped back. The reflection did not. And then, as though the moment had never happened, everything stilled. The mirror returned to what it had always been. Silent, unmoving, ordinary. Eliza turned and walked away, her breath steady, her steps careful. She did not look back. And though she never spoke of it, she knew the truth. The mirror had never been just a mirror, and whatever had been inside it now knew her name. Chapter 18. The house that waited there was a house at the edge of town, nestled between ancient trees where no one had lived for years. Its windows were dark, its doors untouched, yet it never truly felt abandoned. The wind did not stir its shutters, nor did dust gather on its porch. Some said it was waiting for what no one could say. Marian had always been drawn to the house. As a child, she would stop outside its gate, watching the way the light never seemed to touch its windows. Now, as an adult, she found herself there once more, standing at its threshold as the evening air settled into stillness. The key had been left to her in a will she had not expected, from a relative she had never known. No history, no explanation, only an address and a single instruction: return home. She hesitated before turning the key. The lock gave way smoothly, the door swinging open without a sound. The air inside was cool, untouched by time. The furniture remained where it had always been, covered in sheets that bore no trace of dust. The walls held frames, though the images inside had faded beyond recognition. She stepped further in, the silence wrapping around her like something alive. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of waiting. She moved through the rooms, her footsteps measured. The house was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming. It simply was, watching, listening, expecting something she did not yet understand. Then in the hallway, she saw it, a mirror, taller than her, its frame wrapped in carvings she did not recognize. It should have reflected her, should have shown the room behind her. But it did not. Instead, it showed a different house, one just like this, but changed. The walls were warmer, the furniture uncovered, and a soft light flickered from a lamp she had not yet touched. And there, in the center of the reflection, stood a figure, not frightening, not threatening, just there, waiting. Marian did not move. The figure did not either, but as she watched, the air around her shifted, the weight of years pressing gently against her skin. She understood, then, this was not a house left behind. It was a house waiting to be remembered, and she had always belonged here. Chapter 19. The lantern that never went out. In the heart of an old village, nestled between rolling hills and quiet streams, there stood a lantern that had burned for as long as anyone could remember. It hung from an iron post at the crossroads, where the village met the wild woods beyond. No one had ever seen it lit, nor had anyone seen it dim, yet through storms, through winters, through years lost to time, the lantern had never once gone out. Alden had lived in the village all his life. He had passed by the lantern countless times, its soft glow barely noticeable under the midday sun, but unmistakable in the hush of evening. It was simply part of the world, like the trees, the hills, the sky, and yet something about it had always unsettled him, not in fear but in wonder. One autumn evening, as mist curled along the edges of the road and the scent of damp earth filled the air, he found himself stopping beneath it, drawn by something he could not name. The lantern's glow pulsed softly, a breath within the night. He reached up, his fingers barely grazing the metal. The air beneath it was warm, not the heat of a flame, but something deeper, something alive. A whisper stirred, drifting through the quiet. Not words, not voices, but something older, something knowing. Alden pulled his hand back, his pulse steady yet alert. Behind him, the road stretched back toward the village. Before him, the woods loomed, their edges blurred by shadow, and in the space between, the lantern remained, unwavering, endless, waiting. For what, he did not know. But as he walked away, he felt it, that quiet certainty, that gentle hum of something unseen. The lantern would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Some things were not meant to be understood, only remembered. Chapter 20. The train that never stopped there was an old railway line that cut through the valley, winding between hills and forests, its tracks rusted with time. No trains had run on it for years, at least none that could be seen. Yet on certain nights, when the wind was low and the moon hung heavy in the sky, a distant sound would rise through the stillness, a slow, rhythmic hum. The echo of a train that should not exist. Elias had heard the stories since childhood. The ghost train, they called it. A lingering echo from another time, a journey unfinished. He had never believed in such things until the night he found himself standing by the old platform, listening to the tracks beneath his feet. The air was thick with something indescribable, not fear, not unease, but a sense of something vast, something endless. Then ever so faintly, the sound came, the deep, steady rhythm of wheels moving over tracks, not near, not far, just there, threading itself through the quiet. He turned, expecting darkness. Instead, the air shimmered, a soft glow emerging from the mist beyond the trees. A shape formed hazy at first, then solid. A train, its windows glowing dimly, its surface untouched by time. Elias did not move. The train did not slow, and yet as it passed, he saw them. Figures inside, seated in quiet rows, gazing out as if watching the world slip past. Their eyes met his, not searching, not lost, but aware. Passengers on a journey with no end. The last carriage moved past, its light fading into the mist. The sound of the wheels softened, then disappeared entirely. The night was still once more. Elias stood there for a long time, the warmth of the train's passing still lingering in the air. He knew he had seen something real, but some journeys were never meant to be explained, only witnessed. Chapter 21. The door that appeared at midnight. At the heart of the old city, tucked between two forgotten buildings, there was a narrow alley that seemed to lead nowhere. People passed by it daily, never giving it a second glance. It was just another shadowed gap between brick and stone, the kind that existed in every old town, where time seemed to settle into the cracks, unnoticed and unmoving. But those who happened to look at the right moment, just as the clock struck midnight, sometimes saw something impossible. A door. It was tall, wooden, and unmarked, as though it had always been there, waiting. There was nothing particularly strange about its appearance. It was simple, with a brass handle dulled by time, and a deep grain in the wood, worn smooth in places as if touched by many hands over the years. And yet, it should not have been there. By morning, it would be gone. Naomi had heard the stories before, passed along in quiet whispers between those who claimed to have seen it, though few dared to approach. Some said it led to another time, a space where forgotten memories lingered. Others believed it was a passageway to something deeper, something that existed just beyond the edges of what could be understood. She had never given the tales much thought, not until one night, as she wandered through the quiet streets, she saw it for herself. It stood exactly where the alley should have ended, its edges faintly illuminated by the warm glow of the street lamp above. The light flickered slightly, casting shifting patterns across the door's surface, as though it were breathing, waiting. Something about it felt expectant. A strange sensation settled over her, a quiet certainty that this moment was not a coincidence. The door had appeared for a reason. She hesitated, her fingers hovering just above the brass handle. The air around it was warm, carrying the scent of aged wood and something distant, something not quite familiar, but not entirely foreign either. A scent like old books left untouched for too long, like autumn leaves caught in the wind, like the last trace of a dream before waking. She took a breath, and then with the slightest pressure, she turned the handle. The door swung open effortlessly, without a sound. Beyond it, there was no alley, no city. Instead, a long corridor stretched before her, its walls lined with doors identical to the one she had just opened. The space pulsed with a quiet energy, as if the air itself was alive, shifting in unseen currents that moved with the rhythm of something ancient. The floor beneath her feet was smooth, polished wood, cool against her skin. The corridor did not feel abandoned. It felt watched. She stepped inside. As she did, the door behind her eased shut, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the slow certainty of something that had done so many times before. She did not turn back. The air was still, yet it carried a presence. Each door along the corridor was different. Some bore names, others only symbols carved delicately into their wooden frames. Some seemed ordinary, plain and unremarkable, while others hummed softly, as if containing something just beyond reach. She did not know where they led, but she understood, in a way that did not require words, that this place was not meant for the lost. It was meant for those who sought something they had forgotten. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, a path lined with choices waiting to be made. There was no fear, no urgency, only the quiet patience of something that had existed for a very long time, watching and waiting for the right moments to unfold. She took another step forward, her hand trailing against the cool wood of the nearest door. The grain beneath her fingertips pulsed faintly, as if it recognized her touch. She did not know what she was searching for, but the door had appeared for a reason, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 22. The Whispers Beneath the Lake. There was a lake hidden deep within the forest, where the trees grew thick and twisted, their roots stretching into the earth like fingers grasping at something long forgotten. The water was impossibly still, dark like polished obsidian, reflecting the sky with such perfect clarity that it was sometimes difficult to tell where the world above ended and the water began. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, as if it had existed before anything else and would remain long after everything else had faded away. No animals drank from its edge. No fish disturbed its depths. Even in the quietest moments, when the wind refused to stir the leaves, the lake remained undisturbed. It was as if it was waiting. The villagers knew of it, though they rarely spoke about it unless asked. Even then, their words were brief, their warnings vague but firm. They would tell visitors to stay away after dark, to ignore any sounds they might hear coming from the water, and above all, to never call out to it. Some said it was cursed, others believed it was sacred. No one could explain why it was different from any other lake, only that it was. Jonas had heard these stories since childhood, passed down through generations, told in hushed voices around dimly lit fires. He had always felt drawn to the lake, though he never fully understood why. He had seen it before from a distance, always keeping to the safety of the trees, never daring to step too close. But on this night, something was different. The air was heavy, thick with an unusual stillness that made the world around him feel distant. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping insects, the occasional distant hoot of an owl, had all faded into silence. The trees did not sway, and the water remained as motionless as ever. Jonas felt an unease settle in his chest, but it did not push him away. Instead, it pulled him forward. He stepped closer to the water's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. His reflection gazed back at him, perfectly still, untouched by ripples or movement. But there was something odd about it. It was not distorted, not broken, but it felt wrong in a way he could not put into words. Then, just as he was about to turn away, he heard it. A whisper, soft, almost too faint to notice, but unmistakable. It did not come from the trees or the wind, for there was no wind. It came from beneath the water. Jonas held his breath, listening. The whisper was not urgent, not pleading. It was simply there, weaving through the air like something ancient, something patient. It was not speaking in words, at least not in any language he understood, but he could feel it. It was telling a story, not in the way people did, not in sentences or voices, but in something deeper. A memory, unfolding slowly, as if the lake itself was trying to remember. Jonas knelt down, drawn to the sound in a way he could not explain. He expected movement beneath the surface, some sign that there was something there, but the water remained impossibly still, and yet the whisper grew clearer. It did not belong to one voice, nor to many. It was something in between, something that had existed long before names and words. The stories of the villagers had always made it seem like a place of sorrow, a place where voices were lost, but as Jonas listened, he realized they were wrong. The whispers were not lost voices, they were waiting to be heard. The lake was not cursed, nor was it sacred. It was something else entirely. It was a keeper of memories, a place where things that had been forgotten by the world still lingered, softly echoing through the water, never truly gone. The whispers did not ask for anything. They did not seek to be freed, they simply were. Jonas closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He did not understand the words, but he understood their meaning. The lake remembered everything. Chapter 23, The Library That Read Itself. There was a town where the streets curved in gentle arcs, where the cobblestones seemed to hum with the weight of forgotten footsteps. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the rush of the modern world, where stories were passed down like heirlooms, and time felt softer. The town had always felt like it existed slightly outside of reality, a place where memories lingered longer than they should, and where certain things refused to be forgotten. In this town, there was a library that few ever spoke of. It was not on any map, nor was it bound by ordinary rules. Some claimed to have found it at the end of an unfamiliar alley, a place they had never seen before and could not find again. Others swore it appeared just beyond the town square, waiting in the periphery of their vision, only to vanish when they turned away. The stories varied, but one thing remained the same: no one who entered ever forgot. Irene had spent her life chasing stories. She was a seeker of lost books, an archivist of words nearly erased by time. She had searched through ruins, pieced together fragments of histories that had crumbled to dust, and held books so old their pages threatened to disintegrate beneath her fingertips. But nothing compared to what she found the night she stepped through the doors of the library. She hadn't been looking for it. In fact, she had simply been wandering, letting her feet carry her through the quiet streets as dusk settled in with a golden hush. A mist clung to the roads, making familiar paths seem new, shifting the town's edges in a way that made it feel as if it had rearranged itself while no one was looking. And then, as she turned a corner she could have sworn did not exist the day before, she saw it. The library's facade was unremarkable: old brick, a wooden door with a tarnished brass handle. There was no sign above it, no indication that it was a place meant to be entered. And yet, there was something about it, something that sent a whisper through her bones. It was waiting. Irene stepped inside. The air shifted the moment she crossed the threshold. The scent of parchment and ink wrapped around her, rich and warm like the breath of something ancient. A hush filled the space, not silence, but the kind of stillness that comes when something is listening. The library stretched endlessly before her. Shelves upon shelves rose into darkness, filled with books bound in leather, cloth, and paper so delicate it felt like holding breath itself. The ceiling was lost to shadow, and the aisles seemed to shift just at the edge of her vision, rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking. The library did not follow the laws of space. It was deeper than it should have been, wider than the building that contained it, as if it existed both here and somewhere else entirely. But what captivated her most was not the vastness. It was that the books moved. Not with hands, not with wind, but as if the stories within them were alive. Pages turned without touch. Books drifted from shelves, opening of their own accord, and as she stepped deeper into the rows, she realized something strange. The books were reading themselves. Soft whispers filled the air, voices speaking in hushed tones, unraveling stories into the quiet. Some spoke in languages she had never heard, yet somehow understood. Others told tales she had read before, but they were different, more complete, as if this place held the truest versions of every story ever told. She reached out to one of the books hovering in the air. Its cover was worn, the title embossed in gold, yet shifting even as she tried to read it. The moment her fingers brushed the spine, it opened. And the story began. She did not see words, not in the way she had expected. Instead, she saw images, scenes unfolding like memories not her own. A young woman in a distant time, standing on the edge of a vast sea. A man writing by candlelight, his ink never drying, his words vanishing the moment they were read. A house with too many doors, each leading somewhere else entirely. The stories did not stay bound to their pages, they played out in the air, shifting and changing, as if they were being remembered rather than told. Irene pulled her hand back. The book snapped shut. Her heart pounded. This was not ordinary reading. These were not ordinary books. Then she saw it, a book resting open upon a lone table, its pages glowing faintly. Her name was written on the cover. She hesitated. Slowly she stepped forward, drawn to it by something deeper than curiosity. She had read many books in her life, but none that had been written about her. Her fingers trembled as she touched the page. The ink shifted, rearranging itself, as if the story was still being written. And there, in careful lines, she saw it, memories she had not yet lived, choices she had yet to make. A path unfolding before her, waiting. The words changed even as she watched, adjusting to the rhythm of her breath, the beat of her pulse. She turned the page, and the library whispered around her, the stories bending to welcome her own. She did not know how long she stood there, reading the pieces of a future that was still forming. But when she finally looked up, she understood. This library did not exist to hold books, it existed to hold possibilities. And somewhere in its endless halls, hers had already begun. Chapter 24. The House That Waited. At the edge of an old country road, where the trees arched overhead like guardians of an ancient secret, there stood a house. It had no address, no path leading to its door, and no history anyone could recall. Yet it remained, untouched by time, waiting. Mira had seen it before, but only in passing, always just beyond the bend in the road, just at the edge of her vision. No matter how many times she traveled that way, she had never truly looked at it. Until tonight, the road was quiet, the air thick with the scent of earth and fallen leaves. A faint mist curled over the ground, blurring the edges of the landscape, and there, standing in the moon's pale glow, was the house. Mira slowed her steps. Something about it felt different tonight. Closer, more real. The windows reflected no light, yet she felt as if something behind them was watching. The door, made of aged wood and iron, was slightly ajar, as though it had been left open for her. She hesitated. There was no reason to enter, and yet the house had always been there, waiting. The wind carried the faintest trace of something, an old scent, like paper and cedar wood, like something preserved in time, and in the silence of the night, a thought settled into her mind. The house remembers. She stepped forward. The wooden floor beneath her feet did not creak. The air inside was neither warm nor cold. It simply was. Dust hung in the air like suspended breath, but there was no decay, no sign of neglect. It was as if the house had been untouched by time itself. The furniture remained in place, chairs waiting for someone to sit, books resting on shelves as though they had only just been set down. The clock on the mantel stood still, its hands frozen at an hour that no longer mattered. And then there was the painting. It hung above the fireplace, its colors muted with age, yet its details unnervingly clear. A woman stood in the foreground, dressed in a fashion decades old, her eyes gazing outward with something like recognition. Behind her, the house stood just as it did now, unchanged. But it was not the house that made Mira's breath catch in her throat. It was the woman. She looked like Mira. The same dark eyes, the same curve of her jaw. The resemblance was undeniable, though Mira had never seen this painting before in her life. A chill passed through her, not of fear, but of something else, something that felt like memory. She stepped closer. The brushstrokes were delicate, the artist's signature small and faded in the corner. Mira reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the frame, and the house exhaled. A door somewhere in the distance eased open, the scent of cedar deepened. She turned, her heart steady, her breath slow. The house was not empty. It had never been empty. She had been meant to come here, to see the painting, to remember something she had not yet lived. Or perhaps, something she had once forgotten. She did not leave. Not yet. The house had waited for her. And now she would wait too. Chapter 25. The train that never stopped. The first time Elias saw the train, it was just a whisper of movement on the horizon. A dark shape against the mist, rolling silently along tracks that had not been used in decades. It had no schedule, no station, no passengers, and yet it always came. As a child, he had heard the stories. Everyone in town had. Some whispered about it like a legend, something to be dismissed with a shake of the head. Others spoke in hushed, wary tones, as if uttering its name too clearly might call it forth. The train that never stopped, they called it. A train that traveled only at night, appearing in places it had no business being. Some believed it was a ghost of the past, a relic still running its route long after the world had forgotten it. Others said it was a passage, a doorway to somewhere else. Elias never believed in such things, until the night he saw it himself. He had been walking home late, the air thick with the hush of midnight. The road stretched ahead, empty except for the distant sound of wind through the trees. The town was asleep, its lights dimmed, its streets deserted. He had taken this path countless times before, his footsteps familiar against the cracked pavement. But this night felt different. The air carried a weight, a strange stillness that made him pause, and then, without a sound, it appeared. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The tracks that ran along the edge of town had been abandoned for years. No train had passed through in decades. The rails were rusted, overgrown with weeds, nearly invisible beneath layers of time. Yet there it was. A train gliding along the tracks as if they had never decayed. Its body was sleek, polished, reflecting the dim glow of the street lamps, like something out of another time. There was no smoke, no rumbling of metal against metal, just the steady, soundless motion of something that should not be there. Elias stopped, his breath caught in his throat, watching as it slowed, not stopping, not truly, but moving just enough for him to see inside. The windows, once dark, now glowed with a soft golden light. Silhouettes moved within, passengers sitting in quiet stillness. Their faces were calm, serene, their expressions unreadable. They did not look out, they did not acknowledge the world beyond the glass. And yet, as the train passed, Elias felt something shift. A pull, a quiet invitation. It was not a forceful thing, not a demand. It was gentle, almost imperceptible, like a memory stirring at the edge of his mind. The longer he looked, the more he felt it, this sense that he belonged there, that he had always been meant to board. The thought unsettled him, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt right. His feet moved before his mind caught up. He stepped toward the tracks, drawn by something deep, something unspoken. The train was not stopping, but the door, he saw it now, was open. Waiting, the mist curled around him as he approached, his pulse steady, his breath measured. He could feel the warmth radiating from within. The soft glow of the cabin lights beckoning him forward. A single step and he could board. A single step and he would know. For a brief moment, he glimpsed the interior beyond the door, rich velvet seats, polished brass fixtures, an air of quiet elegance that did not belong to this world. And among the passengers, sitting with perfect stillness, were faces that felt familiar. He could not name them. He could not recall where he had seen them before. But he knew deep in his bones that they were waiting for him. The wind carried a whisper, a voice he almost recognized. Not yet. The words brushed against his mind like a breath, a thought that was not his own. Elias blinked. The train was gone. The tracks stretched before him, empty and silent, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The air no longer hummed with its presence. The town was just as it had been, quiet, undisturbed, unaware. But he knew better. The train would come again. And next time, he might not hesitate. Chapter 26. The room that wasn't there. Elaine had lived in the old townhouse for years. It was a quiet place, tucked away at the end of a narrow, winding street, where the street lamps flickered just a little longer than they should before fading into the night. The house was sturdy, built long before her time, with wooden floors that creaked under her footsteps, and walls that held warmth even in winter. It was the kind of home that had settled into itself, worn and familiar, a place of solitude and quiet reflection. She had always loved that about it, the predictability. The way everything remained exactly as it had been. She could close her eyes and navigate the halls by memory, knowing precisely where each door, each window, and each piece of furniture belonged. It was a certainty she had never questioned. But one evening, something changed. Elaine had been reading by the dim glow of her bedside lamp, wrapped in the comfort of routine, when she felt it, a draft, faint but steady, moving through the air behind her. At first, she ignored it. The house was old, and old houses had their quirks. A shift in the foundation, a crack in the wall letting the outside in. She was used to these things. But this was different. The draft was not coming from the window. It was not from the door. It was coming from behind her. A slow unease crept over her as she turned, her eyes scanning the far corner of the room. And then she saw it. A door that had never been there before. Her breath slowed, her fingers tightening around the fabric of the blanket draped over her lap. The wooden frame blended seamlessly into the wall, as though it had always been a part of the house. But she knew better. She had lived here long enough to memorize every inch of space, and there had never been a door in that corner. She rose from the bed, her bare feet pressing against the cool floorboards, careful, deliberate. The air around the door was different, thicker, expectant, as if waiting for her to acknowledge it. The handle was smooth beneath her fingertips, cool to the touch. She hesitated. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her heartbeat loud in the quiet of the room. The logical part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that doors do not simply appear where there were none before. But another part of her, the part that had always believed in things just beyond the edge of understanding, told her to open it. And so she did. The door swung inward without a sound. Beyond it, the room stretched into darkness. The air smelled of aged paper and something else, something soft, familiar, a memory just out of reach. It was not the scent of dust and decay, as one might expect from a hidden space left untouched. It was warm, lived in, as if someone had been here just moments ago. Elaine stepped inside. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes she had never seen before. Some of the bindings were old, their spines cracked with time, while others looked freshly bound, untouched. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its cushion slightly indented, as if someone had just been sitting there. A desk rested beneath a window that should not exist. On the other side of that wall was nothing but the outside brick of the townhouse. Yet here it was. And on the desk, a book lay open. Her name was written on the first page. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. The ink had not yet dried. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the page. The words within the book were in her handwriting, yet she did not remember writing them. Each page was filled with stories, stories of moments she had lived and others she had not. Or perhaps not yet. She turned the pages, her pulse quickening. There were entries of things she had done, places she had been, thoughts she had once carried. But then, further in, were things she did not recognize. Events she had never experienced, choices she had not yet made. And then, a shadow moved in the reflection of the window. Elaine turned sharply. The room was empty. The chair was no longer indented. The air no longer stirred with the presence of something unseen. The shelves stood quiet, the books undisturbed. But she knew she had not imagined it. Slowly she looked back at the book. The words on the page began to shift. New lines forming, new choices being written. Elaine exhaled, closing the book with careful hands. She had always thought of her house as unchanging, a place of comfort and certainty. But now, she understood. Some rooms do not exist until you need them. And some doors do not appear until you are ready to walk through them. The next night, when she looked at the wall, the door was gone. But she knew it would return when it was time. Chapter 27. The Whispering Shore. The ocean had always called to Daniel, not in the way it calls to sailors or wanderers, but in a quieter, deeper way, a voice beneath the waves, humming just below the surface of hearing. He had grown up by the shore, listening to the rhythmic pull of the tides, watching how the waves carved into the land over time. There was something ancient in the way the sea moved, something patient, something that had existed long before him and would continue long after. He never feared the water, nor did he hold it in reverence as the old fishermen in town did. To him, it was simply a presence, constant and familiar. But there was one place along the coastline where even the most seasoned seafarers refused to go. A stretch of beach where the waves never quite broke, where the air was thick with salt, yet no birds ever flew overhead. Even the wind seemed to die there, carrying no scent, no sound except for the whispering of the tide. Locals called it the Whispering Shore. No one spoke of it openly, only in murmurs, in warnings passed from one generation to the next. Fishermen swore the waters there held secrets, that the sand was not like other sand, that it shifted in ways it shouldn't. They said if you listened too closely, you might hear voices calling from the depths. Some claimed the shore was cursed, others that it was merely a trick of the wind, but no one lingered there long enough to find out. Daniel had never believed the stories, until the night he found himself there. He hadn't meant to go. The tide had pulled him along the shore, his thoughts lost in the sound of waves breaking in the distance. It wasn't until the landscape around him changed, until the air thickened, the silence pressing down, that he realized where he had wandered. The Whispering Shore. A quiet unease settled in his chest. The sand beneath his feet felt looser here, shifting as he walked, as though something deep beneath the surface was moving. The waves lapped at the shore, but they never fully crashed, never broke apart into white foam. They simply rolled in, smoothed over the land, and receded again, whispering as they pulled back. And then, for the first time in his life, Daniel heard it. A voice. Not one, but many. At first, the whispers were faint, like wind moving through reeds. But as he stepped closer to the water's edge, they grew clearer, distinct. Not just sounds, words. They were calling his name. He swallowed hard, his breath slowing as he strained to listen. The voices were soft, patient, not urgent or frantic, but steady, like a conversation waiting to be continued. The tide reached his feet, cool against his skin. And then he saw them. Figures in the water, not reflections, not tricks of the light, but faces. Just below the surface, their features blurred by the motion of the waves. Their eyes were open, their lips moving, forming words that never quite reached the air. Their expressions were calm, knowing, as if they had been waiting for him. Daniel felt no fear, only curiosity. The ocean had always called to him, and now he was listening. He stepped forward, the tide rising higher around his ankles. The voices did not change. They did not warn him away, nor did they beckon him further. They remained constant, waiting. One voice, clearer than the rest, finally broke through the others. "You came back." Daniel's breath caught. He didn't know why, but those words felt true. As if he had been here before. As if he had stood on this shore, listened to these voices long ago, so long that he had forgotten. The tide pulled back, revealing the darkened sand beneath the waves. For a brief moment, just before the water rushed forward again, something emerged from the shifting earth. A shape. A stone. No, not just a stone. A marker. His hands trembled as he knelt, brushing away the damp sand that clung to its surface. Letters, carved deep into the stone, worn smooth by time, but still legible. It was his own name. Daniel Whitmore, and beneath it a date. A date from long before he had been born. His breath came shallow, his mind fought for an explanation, for logic, but the truth settled into his bones before he could deny it. The tide rolled in again, sweeping over the stone, pulling it back beneath the sand, as if it had never been there at all. The whispers faded, dissolving into the steady hush of the waves. Daniel stood, his heart pounding. The faces in the water were gone. The voices had retreated, but he knew without question, the ocean had not finished speaking. And one day, he would return to listen. Chapter 28. The Clockmaker's Dream. The town of Ashwick had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where time moved a little slower, where the cobblestone streets bore the weight of countless footsteps but never seemed to change. Its buildings leaned slightly with age, their wooden beams darkened by years of wind and rain, and at night, the flickering lanterns cast long, wavering shadows that danced against the walls like memories refusing to fade. At the heart of Ashwick stood a peculiar little shop, nestled between an old apothecary and a bookbinder's store. It was unassuming, its sign worn and its windows fogged with age, but inside it was alive with sound. Endless ticking filled the space, a steady rhythm that pulsed through the air, as if time itself had taken residence within its walls. This was the workshop of Emery Vance, the town's clockmaker. He had lived in Ashwick for as long as anyone could remember. Some said he had been there when their grandparents were children, his face barely changing with the years. Others whispered that he had long since mastered time, that his clocks did more than simply tell the hour. But those were only stories, the kind that grew in small towns where mysteries had the luxury of lingering. Emery was a man of precision, of quiet patience. His clocks were renowned, not for their beauty, though some were indeed ornate, but for their unwavering accuracy. No matter how the world shifted, how the seasons came and went, his creations never faltered, their hands never slipped, their ticking never wavered. Yet, amidst all the timepieces in his shop, there was one that he never sold. It sat in the farthest corner of the room, resting beneath a glass dome, its golden face dulled by a layer of dust. Unlike the others, it did not move. It had not in years, and yet he never discarded it. Perhaps it was sentimentality, though Emery was not a sentimental man. Or perhaps, deep down, he had been waiting for something. And then, one night, it happened. The clock that whispered, it was a night like any other. The streets outside had long emptied, the lanterns burning low as Ashwick settled into sleep. Emery had been preparing to lock the shop when he heard it, a sound so faint, so impossibly soft, that at first he thought he had imagined it. A heartbeat. Not his own. His gaze turned slowly to the forgotten clock. It had not ticked in decades, and yet there it was, a sound rhythmic and steady pulsing from within the glass dome. His breath slowed as he stepped forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the cover. The dust stirred as he lifted it away. And then, tick, the minute hand trembled, then moved. Tick, the hour hand followed, sliding forward in a motion that should have been impossible. Emery stared, his pulse matching the rhythm of the clock. The time it displayed was wrong. It was not the present, nor the past. It was a time that did not yet exist. A time he could not yet reach. And then, just as suddenly, a step beyond time. The air around him rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop. The walls of his shop melted away. Emery staggered, Blinking against the sudden shift, the scent of aged wood and oil vanished, replaced by something sharper, the smell of rain on stone, though no storm had passed. The air was thick, charged, humming with energy. He was no longer in Ashwick. Before him stretched a city he did not recognize. The buildings were vast, towering into a sky darker than night, their windows burning with an eerie glow. The streets were alive with movement, people passing by, their faces blurred and strangely familiar. He opened his mouth to call out, but his voice carried no sound. No one turned, no one saw him. It was as if he were a ghost, drifting between moments that had not yet arrived. Then, in the distance he saw it. A clock, not like the ones in his shop, not like any he had ever built. This one stood at the heart of the city, massive and ornate, its frame gilded, its hands moving far too fast, spinning, racing towards something unseen. And beside it, a figure stood. Emery's breath caught in his throat. It was him. Older, silver lined his hair, his face marked by the passage of years he had not yet lived. His own reflection, watching the clock with an expression of knowing, of waiting. Emery took a step forward, his hand reaching out, the world shifted, the future waiting to unfold. He was back, the shop stood around him, silent and unmoved. The air was still, the scent of old wood and oil settling into his lungs once more. The forgotten clock sat on the table before him, its hands motionless, frozen in time once more. But he knew that what he had seen was real. Not a dream, not a trick of the mind. A glimpse of something waiting to unfold. He did not know when it would happen, nor how. But somewhere, somewhen, time was already moving toward that moment. The clock had whispered to him once, and he had a feeling it would whisper again. Chapter 29. The door at the end of the hall. Marion had lived in her house for over a decade, long enough to memorize every detail, the way the wooden beams groaned during storms, the way the windows rattled slightly when the wind came from the north, the exact creak of every floorboard. It was a house that had settled into its own rhythm, a familiar presence that had become a part of her life. Yet there was always one thing she could never explain. The hallway at the back of the house was unremarkable, narrow, dimly lit, leading to the attic stairs. But at the very end of that hall stood a door. It was unlike the others. It had no handle, no keyhole, no frame that suggested it had ever been used. It was just there, a silent fixture against the wall. She had tried to ignore it over the years, but she could never quite shake the feeling it was watching her. Not in a literal sense, but as if it was aware of her presence. She never spoke about it. It was easier to pretend it didn't exist. But sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, she would hear something beyond it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like fabric shifting, like something moving in the darkness behind the wood. It never happened during the day. Only when the house was at its stillest, when the world outside had faded into silence, and only she remained awake. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling. But deep down she knew better. Then one night everything changed. She woke suddenly, though she wasn't sure why. There was no noise, no disturbance to rouse her from sleep. Yet something in the air felt different, charged, expectant. She turned her head, eyes adjusting to the shadows in her room, and that was when she saw it. The door at the end of the hall was open, not fully, just enough to notice. A sliver of darkness stretched beyond it, but it was wrong. This was not the kind of darkness that came from an unlit room. It was deeper, heavier, as if it had weight, as if it had weight, as if it were looking back at her. She sat up in bed, her breath steady, her pulse strangely calm. She had expected this. Perhaps not tonight, perhaps not in such an obvious way. But she had always known the door was waiting, waiting for her. She rose from the bed, moving carefully, her bare feet pressing against the cool wooden floor. The air grew colder with every step, and with it came a scent, faint, metallic, like rain on stone. The shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally, shifting as if they were alive, breathing in sync with her own movements. She reached the doorway. Beyond it, There was no attic, no storage space, no forgotten remnants of the past. Instead, the hallway continued. But it was no longer her hallway. The walls stretched impossibly far, lined with doors identical to the one she had just stepped through. Some were closed, others stood slightly open, revealing glimpses of things she could not comprehend. A desk covered in yellowed papers, words scrawled in a language she didn't recognize. A mirror reflecting her own image, except it wasn't in sync with her movements. A rocking chair moving back and forth, though no one sat in it. A quiet, steady presence filled the space around her. She turned back, expecting to see her bedroom beyond the threshold. But the door was gone. The space where it had been was now just another section of the endless hallway, as if it had never existed at all. A whisper filled the air, not spoken aloud, but slipping into her mind like a forgotten memory. Choose, she understood. This place was not just a passageway. It was a choice. Each door led somewhere, to something. Different paths, different versions of herself, waiting to be lived. Some led forward, some led back, some perhaps to things not meant to be known. She reached for the nearest door, her fingers hesitating over the cold brass handle. The moment she touched it, she felt something stir on the other side. Waiting, expecting. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Then, with deliberate intent, she turned the handle. The door swung open, and as she stepped forward, the choice embraced her. Far behind her, unseen in the endless corridor, the door at the end of the hall whispered shut, waiting for the next time. Chapter 30. The Lighthouse That Never Went Dark. There was an island off the northern coast, a place shrouded in mist and forgotten by time. Few dared to sail near it, for the waters surrounding it were restless, the waves moving in unnatural patterns, shifting even on the stillest of nights. The air around it carried an eerie stillness, as if the sea itself hesitated before touching its shores. Yet, despite the storms, despite the decades that passed without a keeper, the lighthouse at its peak never went dark. Its beams swept across the water with unwavering precision, cutting through the fog like an unblinking eye. No one knew who tended to it. No boats ever docked at the island. No supplies were delivered. And yet, night after night, year after year, the beacon shone, guiding, watching. Jonas had always been drawn to it. As a child, he would stand on the mainland shore, watching the distant rhythm of its light, counting the seconds between its pulses. It fascinated him in a way he could never explain, as though the lighthouse was speaking to him in a language only he could understand. As he grew older, his curiosity became something deeper, a pull, a whisper in his mind that never faded. Now, as a seasoned sailor, he felt it more than ever. A quiet, persistent knowledge that the lighthouse was waiting for him. One evening, against every instinct, against the warnings of the old fisherman who refused to speak of the island, he took a small boat and rowed toward the light. The journey should have been treacherous. The waters were known to be unpredictable, the currents impossible to read. Yet, as he moved closer, the sea grew strangely still. The mist thickened around him, swallowing the world behind him, until there was nothing left but the golden glow of the lighthouse ahead, cutting through the fog. He stepped onto the shore. The island was silent, no wind, no waves. Only the distant hum of the turning beacon above. The lighthouse door stood slightly ajar. Jonas hesitated, gripping the damp wood, his heart steady. It was as though the island had been expecting him, as though this moment had already been written long before he ever arrived. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was warm, carrying the scent of burning oil and salt. The walls were lined with old maps, their edges curled with time, their ink faded but precise. Journals were stacked neatly on a wooden table, their spines cracked with age. A single chair sat facing the large window, angled as if someone had just been sitting there watching the sea. But the room was empty. There were no footprints in the dust, no signs of life, and yet nothing felt abandoned. It felt lived in. Jonas ran his fingers over the journals, their leather covers smooth beneath his touch. He hesitated, then flipped one open. The handwriting inside was unfamiliar, neat, deliberate, the ink faded with age. At first the entries seemed ordinary, notes on the tides, the shifting of the stars, the passage of ships long forgotten. Then his breath caught, his own name stared back at him. Entry after entry, written long before he had even been born. Descriptions of his life, his childhood, his choices, his journey across the sea. Every detail, every moment, chronicled with precision, as if the writer had been watching from afar. And then at the very end, "Welcome back." Jonas exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the pages. A shadow flickered in the lantern light. Footsteps echoed from the spiral staircase above, slow, deliberate, moving toward him. He turned, pulse steady, as if he had always known this moment would come. A figure stood at the top of the stairs. It was not a stranger, it was himself. Older, weathered, his own eyes staring back at him, filled with something he could not yet understand. The lighthouse had never been abandoned. The keeper had never left. Because the lighthouse had been waiting for him all along, waiting for him to remember. Chapter 31. The House That Called Her Name. Elena had spent years traveling to the most remote corners of the world, collecting stories that most had forgotten. She had walked through ruins where whispers of the past clung to the stones, spoken with elders whose words carried the weight of centuries, and followed trails of myths that blurred the line between history and something deeper, something waiting to be uncovered. But nothing had intrigued her more than the stories about the house in the valley. It was a place no one lived in, yet no one called abandoned. Its windows were dark, its garden overgrown, and its walls weathered by time, but the stories remained. Travelers spoke of a voice calling from its depths, whispering names as though the house itself remembered those who had passed by. Some swore they had heard their own names spoken in a voice both familiar and distant, a voice that made them pause mid-step, hearts racing with something they could not explain. The house did not call to everyone, but it had called to her. She arrived just as the sun dipped beyond the horizon, the sky awash with streaks of deep orange and violet. The valley was quiet, untouched by wind, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The house stood before her, its presence undeniable, its silhouette framed against the fading light. Its door was slightly ajar, waiting. A lesser person might have hesitated, might have felt the instinct to turn away, to leave the house and its secrets undisturbed. But Elena had never been the type to ignore a call, especially not one that seemed meant for her alone. She stepped forward. As her fingers brushed the old wooden door, a shiver ran through her. The surface was cool beneath her touch, despite the warmth of the evening air. The hinges groaned as she pushed, the sound echoing into the hollow depths of the house. The scent of aged wood, dust, and something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, drifted toward her. It was a scent she had known before, though she could not remember where. The interior was untouched by time. Furniture sat where it had always been, covered in layers of dust, yet undisturbed. A grand wooden staircase curved upward into the dim light, its banister smooth beneath the weight of forgotten hands. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books whose spines bore no titles, their pages waiting to be read once more. She moved deeper inside. The air felt heavier the farther she walked, not oppressive, but charged, as if the very walls were aware of her presence. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt as though someone had been expecting her. Then she heard it. A voice, soft, gentle, speaking her name. Her breath caught. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one. The silence settled again, thick and knowing. She should have felt fear, but instead, there was something else. Recognition. She moved forward, past the staircase, through the corridor that led to the heart of the house. The voice had not called out again, but she did not need it to. She knew where to go. Her fingers traced the wallpaper as she walked, the intricate patterns oddly familiar, like something she had once known in a dream. The scent of lavender grew stronger, wrapping around her, guiding her toward a door at the end of the hall, a door that had been left open. She stepped inside. The room was untouched by dust, by time, by neglect. A fireplace stood cold but unforgotten, its bricks unblemished. The bookshelves overflowed with worn leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with careful, deliberate script. A wooden desk sat in the center of the room, its surface smooth, polished, waiting. Atop the desk, a single candle burned, its wax melting slowly. Someone had been here. Someone had lit the candle. She moved toward the desk, her gaze drawn to a book lying open before her. The pages were filled with handwriting. Her handwriting. She inhaled sharply, fingers trembling as she touched the ink. It was fresh. She turned the pages, reading words she did not remember writing, stories of moments she had never lived, yet they felt familiar, as if she had experienced them in another life, another time. And then, at the bottom of the final written page, a single sentence made her heart stop. "You have always belonged here." A chill passed through her. The warmth of the room shifted, no longer just an inviting presence but something more, something that held her in place, that surrounded her with an unseen force. And then she realized, she was no longer alone. She did not turn immediately. She felt them before she saw them. Figures stood at the edges of the room, their faces obscured by the flickering candlelight, their forms blending with the shadows. They were neither threatening nor afraid. They were waiting for her. She wanted to move, to speak, but the weight of realization pressed into her. She was not a stranger in this house. She was not a visitor stepping into an unfamiliar space. She had always been here. Somewhere, in the depths of the house, the voice spoke again, steady and knowing. "You have always belonged here." She turned toward the doorway, but there was no hallway beyond it anymore. Instead, she saw something vast, something endless, a place she did not understand, yet one she had always known. It stretched beyond the limits of the house, beyond time itself, waiting to be remembered. The candlelight glowed brighter, illuminating the pages of the book before her. The written words told a story, a life lived, a journey taken, but the pages ahead remained blank, waiting for her to write the next chapter. The figures in the room did not move, did not speak, but their presence filled the space, their quiet expectation pressing against her skin. She did not fight it. She did not resist. She picked up the pen resting beside the book. The weight of it felt natural in her hand, as if she had held it before, in a time she could no longer remember. As the first stroke of ink touched the page, she finally understood. She had never been a visitor. She had been returning home. Chapter 32. The Watcher at the Window. The train moved steadily through the quiet countryside, the rhythmic hum of its motion filling the dimly lit cabin. Evelyn sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the landscape rushing past, endless stretches of trees that blurred into the darkness, their branches swaying gently beneath the moonlit sky. She had taken this route countless times before, yet tonight something felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing she could pinpoint, but a subtle wrongness lingered in the air, an unshakable awareness that pressed against the edge of her mind. The other passengers sat in scattered rows, some lost in their books, others absently scrolling through their phones. A few had succumbed to sleep, their heads resting against the cool glass of the windows, oblivious to the world outside. Everything was normal. The train was just another train, the journey just another journey. Still, the unease remained. She turned back toward the window, her own reflection faintly visible against the darkened glass. Beyond it, the landscape remained unchanged, fields melting into forests, the occasional distant house standing alone beneath the stars. And then in the midst of that passing scenery, she saw something standing among the trees. A figure. It was barely more than a silhouette, motionless in the clearing, set apart from the swaying branches around it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as her mind scrambled for an explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of the moonlight, an illusion created by the shifting shadows. That had to be it. Yet as the train moved forward, she realized something unsettling. The figure did not change in perspective, did not shrink or distort as they passed. It remained exactly as it was, as if it were not just standing there, but watching. She blinked, half expecting it to disappear when she looked again. But it was still there, unmoving, fixed in place. Her pulse quickened, a cold sensation creeping up her spine. There was no logical reason for someone to be standing so deep in the forest, alone at this hour, gazing toward a passing train. She tried to make out details, features, clothing, anything that would turn it into an ordinary person, but the figure remained undefined, a dark shape blending into the night. And then in the instant before the trees swallowed it from view, something changed. It shifted, not in movement, but in presence. She felt it, a weight pressing against her chest, an undeniable certainty that the figure was aware of her. Not the train, not the people inside it, but her. A slow, deliberate awareness. The moment passed, the trees thickened, and the figure was gone. Evelyn exhaled, forcing herself to release the tension coiling in her muscles. It was nothing, she told herself. A trick of the eyes, an overactive imagination, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. Minutes passed, and the quiet rhythm of the train filled the space around her once more. She glanced at the other passengers. The elderly woman across from her was dozing peacefully, her face turned toward the window. A man a few rows ahead flipped through the pages of a book, his fingers moving absently as he read. Everything was calm, normal, and yet the feeling remained. She turned back toward the window, telling herself not to look for the figure again. But as she studied her own reflection, something else caught her eye. A shape, not outside the train. Inside, it stood just behind her seat, a shadow barely visible in the dimly lit cabin. Her breath stilled, her body frozen with the realization that she was not alone. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was impossible. She would have heard someone approach, would have felt the presence of another passenger standing so close. But the reflection did not lie. There was something there. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her movements natural. The train was moving. The station was not far. All she had to do was wait. But her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, her senses sharpened by the knowledge that something was standing behind her. The shape did not move. It remained perfectly still, watching. Slowly, cautiously, she shifted her gaze downward, trying to see more without making it obvious that she had noticed. The reflection showed no details, no face, no clothing, only a void where features should have been. Then, as if sensing her awareness, it changed. The darkness where its face should have been shifted, not into eyes or a mouth, but something deeper, something that pulled at the edges of understanding. A void that swallowed all light, all definition, an absence rather than a presence. Evelyn's fingers tightened against the armrest. The train continued forward, its steady motion unbroken, uncaring of whatever was unfolding within its walls. The world outside moved on, unaware of the thing that stood just behind her. The cabin lights flickered, just for a second, but in that brief moment of darkness, she felt it move. Not a step, not a lurch, but closer. The cold that had lingered at her back pressed in, wrapping around her like a weight she could not shake. It was no longer a question of imagination. It was real, the presence, the watcher. It was there. And then, through the numbing quiet, something else emerged. A whisper. Not words, not language. Something deeper, a sound that bypassed hearing and settled into the core of her mind. A voice that did not belong to this world. She gripped the fabric of her coat tightly, grounding herself in the sensation of something tangible, something real. The train was slowing now, approaching the station, the glow of distant streetlights breaking through the darkness. She focused on them, on the ordinary, willing herself not to look at the reflection again. The brakes engaged, the cabin lurched softly, and the scattered passengers stirred, reaching for their bags, preparing to leave. Evelyn inhaled deeply, forcing her body to move despite the cold weight pressing against her spine. The train stopped, The doors slid open. She stood, her movements careful, deliberate. The presence behind her remained, its weight still there, still watching. And then, with every ounce of willpower she had, she turned. The space behind her was empty. Nothing was there. The watcher was gone. She exhaled shakily, stepping onto the platform, the warmth of the station lights spilling over her. The night was cool, the air fresh, but the feeling had not left her. She turned for one last look at the train, at the window where she had been sitting, reassuring herself that it had only been a trick of the mind. But in the reflection of the glass, she saw it, not inside the train, not outside, but in the window itself, a shadow, still watching, still waiting for the next traveler. Chapter 33. The Unfinished Painting. The art studio had stood untouched for decades, forgotten by time, its walls bearing the weight of stories that had long since faded into dust. The scent of drying paint had long disappeared, replaced by the stale air of abandonment, and the wooden floorboards groaned under even the lightest step. Yet, through the thick layer of dust and the hollow silence that filled the space, one thing remained as it always had: the unfinished painting. It was propped against the farthest wall, undisturbed, waiting. The canvas had aged, the edges frayed, but the image itself remained pristine. A woman stood in the doorway of an old house, frozen in the moment, her gaze piercing, her expression unreadable. The details were striking: the way the moonlight kissed the folds of her dress, the slight tilt of her head, the deep shadows cast by the doorway behind her. It was the work of a master, every brushstroke purposeful, precise, and yet, despite its beauty, there was something about it that sent a chill through the air. Lillian had heard the stories before she came. The artist, Victor Moreau, had disappeared before completing his final work, leaving behind only rumors and an unfinished masterpiece. Some said he had gone mad, lost in the depths of his own creation. Others believed he had simply abandoned it, unable to finish what he had started. But there were those who whispered darker tales of a painting that changed on its own, of figures that moved when no one was looking, of voices that echoed in the empty studio long after the artist was gone. She hadn't believed the rumors, not until now. Stepping further inside, she moved toward the painting, her fingers itching to reach out, to confirm what her eyes were seeing. The doorway in the painting seemed deeper than it should have been, the shadows stretching back into something more than just oil and canvas. For a moment, she thought she saw something in that darkness, a faint shape, a silhouette barely distinguishable from the surrounding gloom. But when she blinked, it was gone. A trick of the mind, she told herself. Nothing more. She set down her bag and pulled out her tools. As an art restorer, her job was to bring old masterpieces back to life, to peel away years of neglect and reveal the artist's original vision. That was why she was here, to study the painting, to determine what had been left unfinished, and perhaps to finally complete it. But as she turned back to the canvas, her breath hitched. The doorway was no longer empty. The shadow was back. It was vague, barely a presence, just a smudge of darkness beyond the threshold, but it hadn't been there a moment ago. She was sure of it. A strange sensation crept over her, a quiet unease settling deep in her chest. It was as though the air in the studio had thickened, pressing in around her, urging her to step closer, to look deeper. Something was wrong. She shook off the feeling and reached for a magnifying glass, leaning in to inspect the details of the paint. But just as her fingers brushed the edge of the frame, a sound filled the air. A whisper. It was soft, barely more than a breath, yet unmistakable. It was not the creak of old wood or the shifting of the wind. It was a voice. She spun around, expecting to find someone behind her, but the studio remained empty. When she turned back to the painting, the shadow in the doorway had moved. It was closer now. A wave of cold ran through her, and for the first time, she considered leaving. Something about this was not right, but she had come too far to walk away. She needed answers. Slowly, cautiously, she traced the edges of the canvas, running her fingers along the texture of the paint. It was dry. There was no sign that anyone had altered it. And yet the shadow was growing clearer, taking shape, solidifying into something more than just a smudge of darkness. And then the whisper came again. This time, it was not just a sound, it was a name. Her name. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. The studio seemed to shift around her, the walls pressing in, the dim light flickering, warping. The painting loomed before her, larger than it had been, as if the perspective had changed, as if she were no longer looking at it but standing before the doorway itself. And then, the woman in the painting moved. Not much, just a slight turn of the head, a subtle shift of her gaze, but it was enough. She was looking at Lillian now. A chill spread through her, rooting her in place. The edges of the room blurred, dissolving into shadow, and suddenly, the studio no longer felt like a studio. It felt like something else entirely. The painted doorway stretched wider, the darkness beyond it deepened. Something was stepping forward. Lillian tried to move, tried to pull herself away, but she was frozen, her body unresponsive to the rising panic inside her. The whisper came again, closer this time, curling around her ears like breath against her skin. The painting was no longer just a painting, it was a door, and it was opening. A force pulled at her, unseen hands grasping, dragging her forward. The world around her tilted, and before she could even scream, she was falling into the canvas, into the darkness beyond the doorway. The studio remained silent after that. And the painting? It was still unfinished, but now, there were two figures standing in the doorway, waiting for the next visitor.